way we do it is by manipulating the software ports. I mentioned them earlier. There's 65,535 software ports in TCP/IP Ethernet Internet communications. You know from experience you can open multiple websites at the same time and have them all up on your screen live at the same instant based on how big your internet connection is. But you've only got one internet connection. Think about the software ports. Think about cable TV. Cable TV, you got one piece of coax coming to your house and you got 250 channels, right? Well, the software ports are just like that, except instead of 250 channels, there's 65,535 channels. So what we're going to do is something called network address translation or port forwarding, where we're going to tell the router that if anybody comes knocking on the door and wants to go to a specific port number, to allow that traffic through and forward it to a specific local IP address. Now, if these ports are unfamiliar to you, don't be scared because you use them every day. Every time you type HTTP in the address line of Internet Explorer, you're saying, take me to port 80, okay? And there's many ports that are used for standard network services like FTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, HTTP, DNS, DHCP. They've all got standardized ports that they use. And most of our vendors, on the video side at least, default their DVRs, NVRs, cameras, and encoders to port 80, the HTTP port. And remember how we feel about defaults. Always change them, right? But I digress. We move forward. What we're going to do is what's called network address translation. Now, this is an example of a situation where different routers will call the same feature by different names, or the same function by different names. Some call it network address translation. Some call it port forwarding. Some call it virtual server, but it's all the same thing. I call it port forwarding, okay? And here is how it works. Let's start here in the middle where we've got this line over on the left-hand side between the internet and the local network. What sits between the internet and the local network? Our router. Remember, it's got the two IP addresses. It's got an address on one side and an address on the other side, right? It's got the local address and it's got its wide area network or its internet address. Now, down here in the lower right, we've got our NUO 2040. It's got an IP address 192.168.1.155, and it's programmed. I changed the port from port 80, the management port, from port 80 to port 8550. Okay. Now, that is hooked up to our local switch. We've got a PC over here. This guy on the left-hand side, this guy on the PC, if he's got the username and password and the address and the port number, he can call up the NUO 2040, go on it, look at live and recorded video. Great. The switch is plugged into the router. Now, in the router, there are program fields to do the network address translation. And in this case, we are port forwarding or network address translating port 8550 to IP address 192.168.1.155. So now, when we've got our user out here on the internet who is an authorized user, wants to look at the NUO product, wants to look at the live and recorded video, what does he or she do? They put in the public address of the DSL or cable modem, in this case 4523.45.123, the colon and the port number 8550. Remember the colon and the port number, you always have to use that. That hits the router port forwards to address 192.168.1.155 in the local network, and the customer is going to see the username password challenge from the NUO 2040. So here's how it looks in a typical Linksys. This is the way mine is programmed in my house. So we look for the field where we do the port forwarding, and this field or this program screen, it's always going to have the same features. Again, it could have slightly different name based on who made the router, okay? But this one they call it port range forward. So you see the three entries for the NUO device. Let's talk about how this works. You've got your application name, that's a free-form field. I've got NUO, simple enough. Then I've got the start and the end of the port range. In this case, I've got my management port for my device at port 8010, and it goes from 8010 to 8010. because I don't need a bunch of ports open. I just need one. Or forward, just need one. Now, if I pulled down this box here, you would see that it says TCP, UDP, or both. TCP and UDP are sub-protocols that are used in network communications, okay? And I'm going to tell you to select both. I could give you a real long explanation, but basically pick both, you can't lose, okay? So you pick both. Then you forward that to IP address, local IP address 192.168.1.155, and you enable it. You click the little green check here. Now, notice that there are 3 entries for the NUO device. Port 8010, port 5150, port 5160. The NUO device requires 3 ports to be forwarded. 1 for management, 1 for live video, 1 for recorded video. So all 3 of those port numbers are forwarded to the same IP address, 1.155, which is the IP address of my NUO 2040 on my local network, and they're all enabled. You enable them, and then down here somewhere where I clipped it off is going to be the Save button or Apply Changes button. You got to do that, and now you have set the port forwarding in this device. If anything comes to port 8010, it's going to be forwarded to IP address 192.168.1.55. Same with port 5150 and port 5160. Okay. Now, if you happen to have a Belkin device, they call it virtual server. But the setup is the same. You've got your inbound port, you've got your type. They don't offer you both. They just say TCP UDP. That is both. And then in this case, it's an IP address 192.168.2.200. Okay, so that's what it looks like in a Belkin unit. Now, it's important to understand that if you've got multiple devices on the network that you want to access from the outside, that they be on unique and separate port numbers. You cannot, just like you can't duplicate the local IP address, you can't duplicate the port numbers. You've got to have unique port numbers. I have unique port numbers for my cameras. I can call my cameras through the internet directly without going through the NUO, but I don't really do that too much anymore because I got my NUO 2040. I'll show you at the end. We call it up, boom, all my cameras are there. I can pan them and tilt them. I get the audio out of them. It works great. The NUO becomes the portal for all of my cameras on my network, right? But understand that you can set your cameras up so that they could be individually accessed if that's what you wanted to do. But remember, separate port numbers, unique for each device. And remember, some devices, like the NUO 2040, need more than 1 port to be forwarded. Whatever ports they need, you got to forward all the ports. Each one has to be forwarded.